Lachlan stood in the empty bathroom, his heart pounding in his ears, paralysed with worry and trying to process what had just happened. He didn't know what to do. They'd always been so careful. How could he have let this happen? The one person he could discuss this with and work out a solution with had just left to spend a few days in a potentially incredibly dangerous environment alone. He had to talk to him before he left. He couldn't let him leave like this. Lachlan sprinted out of the bathroom. But as the door swung closed behind him, he crashed into a luggage trolley, sending suitcases tumbling in all directions. One trunk, which had been precariously balanced atop, slammed into the porter, knocking him to the ground and landing on top of him.
Ugh!
Shit!
Said Lachlan as he scrambled towards him and pulled the trunk off his torso.
Are you okay?
Not really. That bloody hurt.
The porter pulled himself into a sitting position and held out his arm.
I'm so sorry.
Help me up, would you?
Aye.
Lachlan grabbed his arm and pulled him to his feet. He heard the train whistle blow and saw the train for Biera roll away from the platform.
Fuck!
Yelled Lachlan, drawing the attention of multiple bystanders.
Sorry.
Lachlan glanced around himself wildly, a crazed look in his eye. The porter raised an eyebrow at his erratic behaviour.
Sir, have you got a train to catch, or are you just hanging around being a nuisance?
I was trying to catch a train to Biera.
Well, it just left.
I know.
Do I need to call someone to escort you out of here?
No, when's the next train?
To Biera? There's one this evening, but it's fully booked. So, tomorrow morning.
Okay, thanks.
He knew the question was redundant, since he wouldn't be able to afford it anyway.
Right, help me put these back on,
said the porter, waving an arm at the luggage Lachlan had sent flying all over the floor. Lachlan helped him, not really concentrating, his mind furiously trying to figure out what to do next. He roughly tossed the bags onto his trolley.
Careful!
Lachlan dropped the last suitcase on and turned to leave the station, as the porter shook his head and walked towards the train. Lachlan paused and pulled out his pipe, stuffed it with tobacco and lit it, before an idea struck him and he turned back to face the direction the man had just left and watched with interest as he pushed his cargo to the end of the platform and started to load it into the luggage stow. He took a deep draw on his pipe and began to formulate a plan. The wind whipped against the sides of the mortuary carriage as it rumbled up the unkempt mountain path. Shanks peered out of the little window, an unimpressed look on his face, as they settled into the carriage and looked up at the trail they were set to follow that would take them up into the misty, grey and wind-battered mountains.
What is this shit? Bloody grim looking up here. And I don't like think the weather's set to get any better. Look at them fucking clouds.
Yes, I can certainly think of a lot of things I'd rather do than ride up a mountain and look at the view in the pissing rain.
Agreed Ion.
Aye, and he's gonna have us standing there posing for pictures while we freeze our nips off.
Piped in another of the group.
Just think of the bonus.
Replied Shanks before he let out a sigh and shook his head. Just then, a small hatch at the front of the carriage opened, and the coachman thrust two fancy-looking bottles of whiskey through the vent.
A gift from your employer,
he announced. For a few moments, no one moved, stunned that the Baron would offer them anything. The coachman let out an impatient cough and shook the bottles until a bemused worker took them and the door slammed shut. The group all looked at each other with raised eyebrows and looks of confusion as the vehicle began to speed up. Shanks winced as the cart rocked back and forth, pushing the twisted metal cage into his wounds.
Pass me that,
he said as he grabbed one of the bottles from the man opposite and took a long swig in an attempt to dull the pain. As soon as Shanks had taken one, the others began to share the second bottle between themselves.
At least this will take the edge off having to spend an afternoon with that pompous prick,
said a man sat by the window as a small titter of laughter filled the carriage.
There's no amount of substances that could take the edge off that,
replied Shanks as they laughed again and the carriage left the village behind. After about an hour, they were all laughing and joking as the carriage had warmed up and the whiskey had put all of them in a marginally better mood.
And then he walked in on him, and his trousers were round his ankles.
Said a scruffy man in the far corner as he slapped his knee and bathed in the raucous response to his tale. Shanks smiled and rested his head on the window for a few moments, his skull shaking slightly as it vibrated on the glass. He watched the sheer rock face roll by, his eyes following the cracks that meandered through it to their multiple destinations, his view occasionally blocked by the trees that leaned in wind-tortured postures. As he watched, something strange caught his eye. Something was silhouetted up on a rock ledge. It was strange and seemed entirely out of place, like it didn't belong there. So much so that Shanks did a double take and questioned his own eyesight in the waning light. No, it was definitely there. A figure, humanoid, but not quite. It looked like some kind of malnourished, ginormous bat or bird. Bony, wing-like formations jutted from its back. As he watched, it seemed to twitch his head to one side and watch him right back. He started, and hurriedly reached a hand next to him and touched Ion's shoulder to show him.
Do you see that?
He questioned, waving his finger in the direction of the thing. He realized as he did so his words were slurring, like he was really drunk. Though he had not really drunk too much more than he would to take the edge off his pain on any day he needed a little extra help managing. Ion tipped his neck forward to peer out the window. His eyes seemed sleepy and unfocused. In fact, as Shanks peered around to take stock of the car, everyone seemed to be far more inebriated than they should be, and his own brain felt heavy and foggy.
What?
Inquired Ion, trying to focus his vision.
Up there, on the rock.
Replied Shanks as he glanced around wildly, realizing he'd lost sight of, well, whatever it was. Shanks was confused.
I saw...
But Shanks trailed off as he realized Ion's head had rolled onto his chest and he had begun to snore. Within seconds, Shanks joined him. It was pouring with rain as the carriage finally rolled to a halt at the spot where the doctor had told them to meet. The Baron lifted a leather-gloved hand and wiped the window misted with condensation, clearing a patch, and peered out. He jumped as he was met with the doctor's sunken black eyes framed in their purple pits glaring directly into his own.
Bloody hell!
He gasped as he clutched his chest in unwelcome surprise. The doctor's lip twitched wickedly as he took delight in the Baron's reaction to him. Alfred shook his head.
Blasted creep.
He whispered to himself as the carriage door clicked open and he hauled himself to his feet and clambered out.
Radisson.
The doctor reached inside his coat and pulled out his pocket watch.
You're late.
He turned the watch and pointed at his face. The Baron squinted.
What? By 1 minute 25 seconds?
He replied incredulously.
Tardy is tardy. When I say meet me at 3, I mean meet me at 3. I'm a very busy man, and I don't have time for folks with no manners. Your mother would never commit such a faux pas.
Alfred felt a fire of rage explode in his belly. This man seemed to pull at every thread of irritation he had.
Now listen here, you cretinous little sawbone. I've had enough of your attitude, and quite frankly, you do not talk to me like this.
The doctor turned his back mid-tirade, scooped up a sailor's duffel bag that lay on the ground where he'd been waiting, slung it onto his back, and started walking.
This way,
he said, beckoning the incensed noble to follow.
What do you... I'm talking here. Hey!
Yelled the Baron, stomping his foot like a spoiled child having a tantrum, shocked at the absolute disrespect and being ignored. The doctor rolled his eyes and turned around.
We have about 1.5 hours until your employees wake up, and when they do, I would be under the reasonable presumption they are going to be more than a little pissed off that you drugged them. Furious, in fact, I should imagine. One couldn't blame them if they wanted to mete out some punishment. Now, would you like them to be completely incapacitated and play their part in your mother's wishes when that happens, or are you and those chubby little legs of yours feeling sprightly enough to outrun the raging mob this afternoon?
The Baron stood for a moment, feeling his cheeks burning red-hot before he breathed out stroppily and stomped through the sloppy mud indignantly behind the rude medicine man. The doctor turned left into a thicket of windswept trees and to a sheer grey cliff face before he dropped to his knees at a random spot on the ground and started to feel around in the dirt and piles of leaf litter. The Baron looked on, baffled. After a few moments, the doctor found what he was looking for. He yanked his arm upwards, pulling up a battered wooden trapdoor with a rudimentary goat symbol etched onto it with what looked like blood and underlined with some kind of runic writing the Baron couldn't read.
Praise be to the knower,
announced the doctor as he touched the symbol with his hand for a moment. The Baron was unclear whether he was supposed to respond in some way.
So glorious to be in your company,
declared Faustus before he let out an excited yet ghoulish giggle, which was jarring and quite at odds with his general demeanour.
Are you talking to me?
replied the Baron, feeling a little uneasy. The doctor was looking in his direction, but seemed to be gazing straight through him. Alfred turned to look behind himself. There was no one there. As he turned back, the doctor disappeared down into the entranceway he'd just revealed. The Baron swallowed and wandered over, extremely unsettled, and felt a shiver run down his spine as he found himself peering down a narrow stone staircase that descended inside the mountain and into complete murky darkness. Just then the wind blew, and he swore he heard the sounds of whispering behind his head. He quickly glanced over his shoulder and flicked his eyes around the small clearing. Though it still seemed to be empty of life, he had a strange sense he was being watched. The Baron jumped as something grabbed his foot and he fell backwards onto his arse. He flipped onto his front and scrambled desperately, trying to pull himself away from whatever had grabbed his limb.
Hurry up,
demanded Faustus, and the Baron turned around to see the doctor's hand resting on the toe of his polished shoes as he squinted at the pathetic man rolling around in the dirt. The Baron blushed in embarrassment. He cleared his throat and stumbled to his feet, brushing off leaves and clumps of mud.
Sorry, I thought I saw a wolf. A big one. In the trees there. So when you grabbed me, I just thought, I thought, you know...
The doctor rolled his eyes and slithered back into the darkness.
Let's go.
His voice echoed from the pit. The Baron scurried after him. The bottom of the steps smelled like paraffin. The doctor reached into a barrel stacked with sticks and yanked one out, revealing a crudely made torch bound with soaked rags, and lit it. He proceeded to lead them through a slender stone corridor adorned with ancient illegible etchings and disturbing artwork, featuring what looked like depictions of its subjects suffering horrific tortures. The rock walls were splintered by the roots of the trees above, clinging like sinewy, gnarled fingers anchoring desperately to the earth against the howling highland winds that routinely tried to rip them from the ground. The Baron shuddered as the sense of creeping fear once again clawed at him. He walked close behind the doctor. Though he hated the man, he hated the thought of being far from company down here more. After a few minutes of walking in silence, they finally turned a corner, and the Baron braced himself for what strange, ominous place the doctor was leading him to. But, as the narrow corridor opened up, it revealed a small underground chapel. There were rows of fine wooden pews facing an ornately carved altar, and the air smelled of frankincense.
Oh,
said the Baron, sounding pleasantly surprised.
This is not what I was expecting.
What were you expecting? I haven't told you anything,
replied the doctor.
I don't know, but this is quite nice.
The doctor smirked and tossed the bag on his back to the ground, where it landed with a heavy thud. He walked to the back of the little Bethel, crouched down and opened a large wooden trunk tucked into the corner. Before he reached inside, he pulled out a little brown bottle from his coat, popped the cap, dribbled a healthy splash onto his sleeve, and breathed in heavily. His eyes rolled back for a moment, but then the familiar wave of excitement shot through him, and he descended into a hysterical laughing fit.
It's showtime,
he whispered excitedly to himself before letting out another almost childlike giggle. The Baron looked over at the strange man, crouched like a mad gremlin in the corner. He could not wait to be far away from this fucking crackpot.
Did you say something?
The doctor crooked his head over his shoulder in a jerky movement. He looked deranged.
No, not to you.
Okay.
The Baron shuffled uncomfortably on the spot and glanced around the room to see who else this freak could possibly be talking to.
What are we doing here?
The doctor span back to the box and scooped up its contents before he hurried across the room and shoved what seemed to be a robe hard into the Baron's chest.
Put this on.
Before the Baron could respond, the doctor dropped to his knees, ripped open the duffel bag and yanked a fluffy white animal from inside with a Hessian sack over its head. The Baron took a step back as a rush of chemical smell hit his nostrils.
Bloody hell!
He announced as he coughed a little.
What is that smell?
The doctor yanked the hood off the little creature, revealing an unconscious goat.
Chloroform. Just makes the process of hauling them up a mountain a little less strenuous. She'll wake up in a minute.
Right.
The Baron looked down at the robes that the doctor had shoved into his arms and let them unravel. He wrinkled his nose. They smelled damp, and there were some sticky stained patches that looked distressingly like old blood.
Have these been washed?
The doctor raised an eyebrow as the Baron held the clothes out at arm's length, peering down at them disgustedly. The doctor let out a snort of amusement.
Oh yes, absolutely, your lordship.
The Baron raised an eyebrow.
It's just there seems to be old, crusty blood on these, so...
No, of course they haven't been washed. They are ancient robes buried inside a mountain. Who do you presume would be popping up here and doing the laundry?
Oh, well, I'm not wearing those.
The Baron dropped the robes in disgust.
Suit yourself.
The doctor pulled his own robes over his head and proceeded to retrieve a scalpel from inside his pocket and swiftly sliced open the palm of his hand.
Oh, God.
The doctor let a few drops of the bright ruby blood now streaming from his closed fist onto the white fur of the young goat, which was now beginning to stir, before he jumped up and slapped his hand onto Alfred's face, far harder than was necessary, leaving a bloody handprint staining his cheek and red flecks splattered across his white shirt and expensive jacket. The Baron crumpled sideways, clutching his face.
Oh, what the fuck do you think you're doing?
The doctor looked on, his demeanour calm and stoic, but a glimmer of sadistic amusement twitching in the corner of his mouth.
My job. It's all part of the ritual.
Wow, well, that bloody hurt.
Replied the Baron, still holding his jaw and nursing his injury.
Was it necessary to hit me so hard?
Oh, absolutely. All part of the rite,
responded the doctor, barely containing his glee at seeing the noble in pain. It was then that the Baron noticed the blood splatters on his favourite jacket.
Oh, my clothes!
Told you to put on the robes,
said the doctor matter-of-factly as he slapped his bloody hand onto his own face with far less aggression and muttered some kind of incomprehensible chant under his breath. The Baron stared at him incredulously for a moment before snatching the robes from the floor and throwing them over his head, resolving to get this over with as quickly as possible. He'd send someone to exact revenge on this absolute loon as soon as he was back in the city and off his mother's shit list. The doctor slowly rose to his feet, scooped the goat from the ground and walked towards the altar at the front of the church. Shank's face twisted and fluttered as he felt something cold and wet drip onto his face and felt his back pressed against frigid hard stone. He blinked one eye open. His head was pounding with what felt like a terrible hangover. As he tried to move his hand up to rub his temple, he realized his arms were pinned to his side. He flicked his open eye downwards and saw that he was strapped down with a thick leather medical strap, the type he'd seen used on his uncle at the asylum as a kid, and a wadded ball of material had been stuffed and tied haphazardly into his mouth, sticking to his tongue and sucking it dry of liquid. He glanced around, and though his eyes struggled to adjust, he realized he was sitting in a completely rock room. It looked like a chapel, with a small wooden altar at one end, each leg intricately carved with an ornate animal head, with red jasper set in the eye sockets. An elegant display of the solar system was inlaid into the front, each planet glimmering with a different-coloured precious stone. A dead goat kid dangled from above like a ghastly marionette, its throat peeled open, and its snowy fur soaked in crimson blood that looked like spilled red wine. The blood dripped onto the altar and wove into the cracks of the high-wrought woodwork like rivers, gilding the carved patterns with ruby highlights. Behind the altar, 2 men stood, dressed head to toe in black garb, their faces painted with bloody spiral woad-like decoration. They were muttering to each other. What the fuck was happening? Was he still dreaming? He looked down at his constricted chest again and flicked one hand up, managing to catch one of the bars at the base of his cage and yank it. He felt a twinge of sickening pain reverberate into his wounds and knew he must be conscious. Something moved next to him. He tilted his head and saw Ion there, tied up the same as him, and the rest of the folks he had come here with tied up in the same way, clearly unconscious. They were stuffed haphazardly into the pews, laid facing the horrifying shrine, arranged as a lurid and unconsenting congregation. Shanks felt his stomach drop as his brain tried to piece together what on earth could be happening. One thing was clear. This had to be the Baron's doing. Never trust a fucking aristocrat, he thought immediately. Finding himself in this situation was somehow almost unsurprising to him, as it seemed that the consistently turning wheel of his life was punching him in the face once again. A bolt of rage and a familiar feeling of being let down and fucking shafted shot through him. Shanks shut his eyes again for a moment as he tried to take stock and fought with his hazy mind, wrought with confusion on how he was going to get himself and the others out of this mess. He heard the noise next to him again. He opened his eyes and saw Ion wake up. His eyes adjust and then widen in abject fear. He looked as though he were about to scream. Shanks quickly moved his leg lightly on the ground to attract his attention. Ion looked up at him. Shanks shook his head and tried to give him a confident, cross-comforting look, or the best version of that he could muster in the moment. Ion seemed to understand, though Shanks could see his chest begin to rise and fall at a faster pace as panic gripped him in her unyielding claws. He tipped his hands upward again and began feeling at each bar at the bottom of his cage. He knew one was loose. He pushed at them like the prying tongue in the mouth of a child pressing against unsecured teeth until he felt one give slightly. He wrapped his middle finger around it and pulled as hard as he could, and after a few moments of pulling and wiggling back and forth, it popped free. He glanced back at Ion, who was watching intently, and then back to the wire. He jerked it downwards, and the other end fell into his lap. Slowly, he screwed it upwards and hooked it onto the buckle on his front and stabbed at it, trying to push it open. Alejandra grabbed onto the guide rope in the sump and took a few moments to breathe and slow her heart rate. This was not recommended, and she knew how dangerous it was to use an underwater guide rope alone with no spotters. Even in an alert and well-rested state, this was a huge risk, but like this, exhausted and shaking from exertion, the risk was tenfold. Yet, there really was no other choice. She breathed a deep breath and submerged herself into the icy pool. The cold water sent prickles through her flushed cheeks, and she felt her chest tighten as her body immediately responded to the temperature drop. She started to carefully move down the rope, completely blind in the murky waters. As she swam, her mind tried to become her enemy, and she couldn't help but think about what Tom had experienced there. Her heart started to beat faster, and a shudder went down her spine. About halfway through the sump, she thought she felt something brush her face lightly and let out a small underwater yelp before she sped up and made a much less measured bolt for the end. As she emerged from the sump, she gulped in a huge breath and stumbled out of the water, coughing and spluttering as she went. She flicked her headlamp on and spun to check behind her. Of course there was nothing there, and she quickly realised her hair was dangling limply in front of her face. She let out a small chortle of relief. And judged herself for allowing herself to give in to her base anxiety and get scared by her own hair. She rolled her eyes and shook her head at her own reaction, though this short moment of reprise was interrupted when in the light of her headlamp she noticed the little rock bowl adorned with the ferryman's demands, dragging her right back into the hellish scenario she found herself in. She shuddered and began pulling off her wetsuit, eager to get dry and warm as quickly as possible before she continued to the surface. Shanks watched in horror as the two men, now wearing masks, walked through the maze of pews filled with all the other workers before turning to face each other from either side of the chapel. Both nodded as if they were about to duel, before removing large antler-handled knives, their polished silver blades glinting menacingly in the dim candlelight glow of the cavern. Shanks furrowed his brow and squinted into the darkness as he tried to work out what they were doing. Just then, they began to march towards each other. As they walked, they lifted their masks. The candlelight lit up their faces, and Shanks clocked the Baron and felt a hot surge of venomous hate rip through his stomach. Shanks heard Ion let out a horrified gasp, which he quickly tried to stifle, as they lowered their arms in unison and proceeded to slit the throats of the two unconscious men nearest each of them. Crimson blood spurt from the neck of the man closest to them as his killer sliced through his jugular with practiced precision and drained him in just a few seconds. The Baron struggled as he tried to unsuccessfully wrench the knife free from his victim's neck, who had begun to stir and moan in terror. The other fellow shook his head and strode towards them, and in one fell swoop plunged his own knife deep into the casualty's chest with a sickening squelch. Shanks heard the moans of pain turn into bubbling gags and chokes and breathed deeply, trying not to panic. His ears rang and he panted with fear as he watched the pair continue their strange ritual. The first man returned to his victim, bent down, and used the tip of his knife to scratch something roughly into the skin of his forehead. Shanks could hear the knife had gone straight through flesh and was scratching against the bone of his skull. The Baron watched what he was doing and tried to imitate it, but as he felt the skin splitting under his knife, he promptly began to vomit. The other man shoved his victim sideways so his head hung over the end of the pew, and his blood leached down into a thin gutter dremelled into the rock and slanting downwards, sending the warm blood flowing into a small moat surrounding the altar, already filled with goat's blood. As the two different hues of blood grasped each other with finger-like rivers, the candles flickered in an odd and stilted manner, and Shanks felt a strange prickle through his skin as a cold breeze seemed to somehow blow through the still underground chamber. A strange, thick black smoke began to billow from the gutters like London smog and swirl in tiny whirlpools across the floor. The candles flickered again, and suddenly a human-like figure appeared behind the altar. Shanks felt his heart drop inside his chest as two osseous wings mounted with flapping, tattered membranes and sporadic tufts of black feathers slowly unfurled, sending downy, stringy, wet quills drifting to the floor and revealing a skeletal frame, grey-skinned with shards of bone poking from its festering, stretched flesh like horns. It flicked its yellow eyes right at Shanks, and he felt as though his blood had turned to jagged ice crystals in his veins and was scratching the walls that contained it with each pump. He had never felt anything like it. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the room seemed to glitch and fuzz, and Shanks felt a pulsing migraine behind his eyes, and it was gone. Shanks could see the man he didn't know shudder involuntarily before he smiled in a crazed grimace and looked directly at the spot it had appeared and was sure he'd seen it too. He knew it was the thing he'd seen on the rocks. The doctor turned back to the task at hand and rolled his eyes at the Baron, who was still bent over, retching, strode towards him and snatched at him in as rough a manner as he'd toppled the fresh corpse onto the pew moments before, and began to stump towards the front of the chapel, where the last two of the party of workers, barring Shanks and Ion, were bound in place. He shoved the Baron to the opposite side, grabbed the unconscious victim in front of him, and jerked him forward so he slumped down from his pew and onto his knees with a thud. He held him in place with one hand as his head lolled forward like a puppet with no one guiding its strings. He glanced towards the Baron, who had not followed his direction. His jaw twitched as he clenched it in irritation. He breathed out heavily before he once again crossed the aisle and gripped the Baron's shoulder, guiding him to pull his own sacrifice to the ground and continue the ritual between violent heaves. The Baron's eyes leaked with tears sprung from the stress on his body as he lifted his knife with quivering hands and attempted to perform the next step in the process. To lift the head of the poor soul bowed in a prayer position in front of him and repeat the process of severing his throat. He gripped his hair and presented his neck to the sky. His hands were shaking and clammy as he pulled the knife back and slashed weakly at the gullet, the knife vibrating in his palm as he travelled over the thick, muscular trachea and barely caressed the flesh he was supposed to be cleaving open. He retched again. Shanks could feel his heart pounding in his chest as frigid sweat trickled down the back of his neck. He tried for the umpteenth time to push the buckle open. He had to stifle a grunt of exultation of finally succeeding in his task as it eventually popped free. It was then that the pair began to walk towards the spot where Shanks and Ion were stashed. He had to close his eyes and lean his head back into the shadows. He could hear rustling next to him, emanating from where Ion had been placed. He peeled his eyes open in time to see the boy getting dragged away towards the altar. He caught his eyes, and the abject fear he saw in them stabbed at his soul. They lifted him onto the altar, where the blood, still leaking from the slaughtered goat, dripped onto his face in tepid, coagulating globules. Ion started to struggle and attempted to yell, but quickly began to choke on a tight gag forced into his mouth. The men wrenched his hands down and fastened them to the two rusted metal loops that dangled from the sides of the bastardized chantry. Shanks wriggled free from his bindings as quickly as he could manage. The man standing on the far side of the altar lifted a book that had been placed on a lectern to one side. The book's cover was a roughly hewn stitched patchwork of what looked like multiple fragments of human skin. He began to read a strange and indecipherable chant from it. As he started to speak, the Baron lowered his head downward, as though he was praying. Shanks slowly lifted himself to his feet, thanking himself for not taking off his gag, as it stifled the groan of pain that leaked from him as the metal rods around his ribs jabbed into his festering wounds at an uncomfortable angle. A shudder of agony flashed through his body as his chest squeezed deeply and involuntarily as he had to pause for a moment to catch his breath, and his head spun in a dizzy haze. By the time he regained composure, the room had gone silent. No more sinister incantations. He flicked his eyes back at where Ion lay, trapped like a helpless rabbit in a snare, in time to see one of the deer bone knives suspended above him in the hands of the man he didn't recognize. Before he could react, there was a crashing noise that echoed around the stone chapel. Out of nowhere, Lachlan flew into the room and pounded down the aisle before launching in an almost inhuman leap at the altar, where he careened into the Baron, flung him sideways like he weighed nothing at all, and sent him smashing to the ground, where he yelped like a small dog. As he rolled onto his back, the candle glow lit his features, and Shanks saw the Baron's round, rat-like face a foot from his own. Without a moment's thought, he dived on top of him and began to thrash at his face like a feral animal. All the rage at being brought here, and on top of that, the need for revenge for the mistreatment of the last decade, pressed like a bug under the thumb of this piece of shit, and the pain he'd suffered for years of his life flowed through his fists like a tsunami of lava erupting from a volcano after centuries of lying dormant. Shanks had seen red and was deaf to the bones crunching under his flailing fists as he shattered the eye socket of the royal beneath him. The Baron tried to fight back, but as he finally managed to hook a finger inside Shanks' mouth and tried to pull his cheek sideways in an attempt to stop the attack, it tore open like wet tissue paper, revealing a putrid yellow and rotten jawbone underneath. Behind him, Lachlan was wrestling with the doctor, forcing him against the wall. The doctor's arms were shaking with the effort of holding the knife in front of him. Lachlan had no fear of the blade, which trembled only centimetres from his throat, but continued shoving the man back and away from his love. He continued to push so hard that its razor tip brushed his Adam's apple, and a little trickle of blood immediately slithered down his throat and pooled in the dip of his collarbone. The doctor's eyes were wild with fear as Lachlan didn't flinch in the slightest. He was a man possessed with a primitive rage, a need to protect the one he loved, and the desire to seek revenge on anyone who'd wished to cause Ion harm. Abruptly, Lachlan's hand shot upwards, grabbed his wrist and bent it backwards at an unnatural angle, and with so much power that it crunched foully as the knife slipped from his grip and clattered to the floor. Lachlan's other hand thrust forwards in a tight fist and planted a forceful uppercut on the doctor's chin. His head snapped backwards like his neck was made of rubber, his teeth mashed, cracking like lightning as he immediately slumped to the floor like a sack of shit, floppy and completely stunned. Lachlan swung around, stumbled towards Ion, and began freeing him from his bonds. He yanked the gag from his mouth.
Lachlan,
he choked from a dry throat, but that's all he could manage to get out. Lachlan flashed him a quick look of acknowledgement, but was too pumped full of adrenaline to respond properly. He ripped the last knot free and grabbed Ion around his torso, pulling him close and feeling their panicked hearts pounding against each other. He lifted him and positioned him onto his back. By now, Shanks had punched the Baron into a gruesome, bloody pulp. His face no longer recognisable as anything resembling human. His nose lay shattered and flattened against his swollen eye socket, and his front teeth were now resting in a sump of blood collecting in the back of his throat atop a ruptured trachea. Shanks sat breathing heavily, sending puffs of condensation in front of him, and staring into space while his brain tried to process what had just taken place. The red that had clouded his vision now tattooed and stained his skin. Lachlan had only one focus, to get him and Ion the hell out of here. He began marching towards the exit, but Ion squeezed his shoulder muscles to stop him.
Shanks,
said Ion slowly and in a caring and calm tone. Shanks didn't move. He just continued to stare through space, frozen, hunched, mouth hanging open, face twisted in shock, like a stone gargoyle on the parapet of a church.
Shanks, come with us.
He tapped Lachlan's chest, and they moved towards the feral man, and using one arm to steady himself, he reached down and touched his newfound friend's shoulder and squeezed it lightly and in as soothing a manner as his adrenaline-filled body would allow. Nothing. Abruptly, Lachlan felt a solid, aggressive shove into his side, and a sharp pain ripped through his torso as he went soaring sideways and fell hard into the dirt, the gravel tearing at his cheek as he grazed across the floor with force. He breathed in the cloud of dust that burst up around him as Ion slipped from his back and joined him in the dirt. He flung his hands to his ribcage in a natural reaction to the pain, and where they should have met his torso, they instead hit the coarse bone that gilded the knife handle. He twitched his head down and saw the knife he'd removed from the doctor's hand sandwiched between his ribs. He had no time to process his injury before a heavy leather boot swung from out of view and connected with his nose, which made an awful snapping noise as it split open and blood gushed out of it and flooded down his face. For a few moments he saw naught but stars in front of his eyes as he reeled from the impact.
You stupid little fuck! You nearly ruined everything!
Echoed a voice above him. As the galaxies whirling in front of his eyes slowly began to fade, the man came back into view. He glared down at him, a rampant fury burning in his mad eyes. He swooped down and wrenched the knife from Lachlan's ribs. Lachlan gasped in agony.
And now it's going to be a lot worse for you and your little mangled friend.
He grabbed the scruffy and now bloodied hair hanging in front of Lachlan's eyes and used it to rest his head to face Ion before he lurched forward, knife in hand, aimed directly at his chest. At that moment, there was an animalistic cry from behind Lachlan's head, and Shanks scrambled over him and tackled the man to the ground.
Don't you fucking touch him, you piece of shit.
The doctor let out a squeal like a stuck pig, and Shanks howled like a wolf as his weight on his own cage bent the bars inwards, forcing them into his own open lacerations and piercing fresh wounds into the doctor's stomach, tearing through both their flesh like parchment. Shanks rolled sideways, and before anyone had time to react, the doctor had forced his knife into the now busted open cage and plunged his fingers as deep and hard into the boggy old wound as possible and twisted his arm like he was churning butter, slicing ad hoc through as many bits of the human offal as he could. Shanks squawked in torment. Instantaneously, the shrill screech was joined by a strange grinding sound, and the ground started to rumble, and pebbles and small stalactites began to drop from the ceiling.
Run, lads!
Yelled Shanks in a shaking voice and blinding pain, as in a last throw he deliberately flopped forward onto the doctor, pinning him to the floor. Lachlan kicked into autopilot. He'd worked in the mines as a kid, and his brain, though addled with adrenaline and completely disassociated at this point, reacted on instinct. The pain in his ribs and face was gone. He was completely numb as he rolled to his feet, scooped up Ion, and bolted towards the doorway. He had to dodge left and right as the small stones had turned to larger slabs and were crashing to the floor like tiny meteors. Finally, they reached the stone staircase and began their ascent. Behind them, the doctor struggled under Shanks' now lifeless form. He clawed his way up to the altar and tried to limp across the room, his abdomen squeezing frothy blood from his puncture wounds. But his journey was cut short, as a huge slab of rock slipped from the ceiling, cracked him across the back of the head, and everything went black. Cash and Gianna finally slowed after what seemed like a subterranean marathon, having bolted through the labyrinth of tunnel back to the strange cylindrical vault they had been redirected from by the strange apparitions. Cash leant against a wall and dropped to the floor, gasping in air and cradling a stitch in her ribs. Gianna bent slightly forward and rested a hand on her shoulder as she too tried to slow her frantic breathing and allow her body a moment's pause from the extreme exertion it had been put through. For a few moments, neither of them spoke, and the tube was filled only with the ricocheting echoes of their mismatched breath.
What the fuck was that?
Said Cash eventually.
I don't know, but it's bad.
Cash agreed.
Really, really bad.
Do you think other cavers have seen it?
I mean, I hope not. It was very hidden and we're really far down here. If anyone did, I'm sure they'd tell the authorities, right?
I don't know. Something feels really off. Like, who are those people?
I dinna ken.
Cash shuddered involuntarily as her mind tried to comprehend why someone would create such a heinous display of suffering and death.
It seems like it's definitely been there a long time, but what the...
At that moment, there was a strange shuffling sound from the tunnel they had just sprinted through. Cash's hand shot forward and whipped in front of Gianna, instinctively placing a barrier between her and whatever new abomination this was. They both stared at the entrance in dread, as once again their heart rates skyrocketed and they pressed themselves backwards into the cold cave wall. As he did on a regular basis, the doctor cozied and nuzzled into the cool and slightly damp body next to him. But as he reached for the oil lamp beside his bed and his hand hit naught but dirt, he sat bolt upright. He was in the chapel. Kian had his eyelids sealed shut as tight as physically possible. His body was stiff as a board, and his heart felt like it was going to shatter through his chest wall like a brick through a window. Whatever it was on top of him, still gripping his wrist in its damp fist. The hairs on the back of Kian's neck stood upright like an anxious dog's hackles. He let out a yelp as he felt hot breath discharge onto his face, followed by warm, viscous liquid which slopped down onto his clamped eyelids, pooling in a sickening, wet mass. Whatever it was breathed again, and the cramped hole filled with an unbelievable stench. Somewhere in the recesses of his terrorized mind, Kian recognized it as almost identical to the stink he'd smelt upon finding a dead fox whilst exploring a bog back in Ireland, festering, maggot-ridden, and floating in filthy swamp water. Kian felt his stomach clench in a visceral reaction to the noxious fumes. There was a strange jolt, and Kian felt pressure on his chest as the thing dropped down on top of him, cold and moist. He shuddered as the next thing he felt was a spongy and frigid protrusion brush against the skin of his neck and sniffed deeply. His skin crawled. Kian swallowed hard and choked. The action let more of the stink into his nostrils. The thing continued breathing him in and moved across his collarbone like the horizontal slide of a typewriter. As it shifted sideways, little wisps of its dirt-caked hair brushed against Kian's chin repulsively. Although every fibre of his being was triggered with immeasurable alarm, a weird and unexpected thought cut through Kian's thread-warped mind, clear as day. Although his basic prey instinct told him just to stay in the dark, unaware of what this unseen terror was, and just accept whatever horrific end awaited him if he did so, this voice commanded him to try and turn on his headlamp. Almost feeling in opposition to his free will, he lifted his head a few centimetres off the ground and, breathing in a broad, nerve-steadying breath, pressed it into the ceiling of his stone confinement. The tiny cavern burst into brilliant light.
Oh, fuck!
Yelled Kian in agony as the introduction of illumination burned his retinas. The thing screeched too. As Kian's eyes adjusted, he saw it and screamed again. Lachlan and Ion burst into the outside world and gasped in huge gulps of fresh air as they finally escaped the clutches of the tunnel. The release from the cave seemed to immediately release Lachlan's overworked muscles, and he dropped Ion to the ground, fell onto his knees next to him in the damp grass, and immediately burst into tears. Ion rolled onto his belly and laid his head in his lap, lifting his hand and clinging to him as tightly as he could. The doctor sat on one of the large chunks of ceiling that had dropped down during the cave-in. He'd set up all the candles he managed to find in the rubble around the mutilated body of Shanks. Such an interesting specimen. The now collapsed cage around his middle was certainly a unique solution to protect the potash-rotted body underneath. He'd never seen anything quite like it. Yes, this one would assuredly be one for his collection. He rubbed his hands together excitedly like a cockroach that had found a hunk of rotted meat. But how best to display him? He took another deep huff from his handkerchief and felt the warm haze send his mind into the familiar gooey squeeze. Then it hit him. He would build it as an homage to him. Peter would be so proud of his work. It was perfect. The Entities is a Grim Pickings production, Created, written, directed and edited by Kat Clifford. Co-edited by Lee M.M. Starring Gabriella Good, Alex Chu, Lee M.M., Kat Clifford, Jem F., Izzy Matthews, Thomas Shajan Walsh, Casey Finn, Steve Clifford, and Darian Brown. As you may have noticed, if you follow the show, we do now have a Patreon, and you can join that Patreon absolutely free. We do have a paid level as well. If you like what we do and want to donate us some money, that would be awesome, but you don't have to at all. What we're trying to do is build a community for the show. We're going to be putting extra content on there, including freaky footnotes, which is going to go into some of the true historical facts that inspired the spooky plot lines of the show, and we would love you to all be a part of it. Thank you for listening.